Section 5 in this chapter is bias in sampling. So if the results of a sample are not representative of the population due to the sampling method, then the sample has bias. And I make this distinction where we say because of the sampling method, because it's totally possible to do everything right with your sampling and still get a sample that doesn't really represent the population well. That's just because sampling is always a matter of chance. When we're selecting a random sample, that means that it is random, and you can get samples that are extreme in that they have an extraordinary number of one segment of the population and maybe none of another segment of the population. So 3 sources of bias. 1 is sampling bias, 2 is non-response bias, and 3 is response bias. Sampling bias means that the technique used to obtain the individuals to be in the sample tends to favor one part of the population over another. So this is something that was wrong with your sampling method. Samples have to be carefully selected in order to get something that's representative of the population. Making claims about a population based on a sample with missing data is a common error made in statistics. Here's an example. A newspaper article reported that a majority of Americans disapproved of the war in Iraq, according to a poll conducted by calling phone numbers selected at random from 10 major metropolitan areas. The sampling bias in this example, there are actually at least 2 different things that we could talk about. One was this was done by calling phone numbers. That means that someone who didn't have a phone or whose phone number maybe was unlisted would have been left out. The second was that the phone numbers were selected at random from 10 major metropolitan areas. That means that a large segment of the population was excluded. Anyone who wasn't in one of those 10 metropolitan areas would have been excluded even from the selection process. So this sample had missing data. It would not be representative of all Americans. It would only be representative of Americans in those 10 major metropolitan areas who had phone numbers that were listed. Another type of bias is non-response bias. This exists when the individuals selected to be in the sample who do not respond to the survey have different opinions from those who do. One way this can happen is, for example, if surveys are mailed out and a large number of people don't respond to the survey or don't mail them back in. Now there are ways to improve this. For example, if you're making phone calls, you can call people back if they don't answer the first time, or you can offer rewards or incentives for people to actually respond to the survey. Another thing to be careful of with this type of surveys is if you have a voluntary response sample or a self-selected sample. This is one where the respondents themselves decide whether to be included. People who do respond to this type of survey tend to be those with strong opinions about the issues involved. In other words, if you don't care much about the issue, you're not very likely to take the trouble to respond. Here are some examples. A survey published in a newspaper where respondents must visit a website, call an 800 number, or mail in a form to participate in the survey. Again, the people who are likely to respond to this type of survey are those who have strong opinions. And you see voluntary response surveys a lot. They're common in magazines and newspapers, television, on the internet, but the results from these type of surveys are not statistically valid. They are extremely biased. A response bias exists when the answers on a survey don't reflect the true feelings of the respondent. Some types of response bias: one is interviewer error, another one is misrepresented answers, a third is the actual words used in the survey question, and for this, survey questions can be deliberately worded to encourage a specific response, often by using words that are emotionally loaded. And a fourth one is the order of the questions or the words in the question. This can affect the likelihood of a certain response. Here are some examples. Loaded questions. Do you believe that gun control laws, which restrict the ability of Americans to protect their families, should be eliminated? So here, some of the emotionally loaded words are restricting the ability of Americans to protect their families. That's a very emotionally loaded topic. Also in this question, the fact that the question only really gave one choice. It asked if gun control laws should be eliminated. It didn't even name the other choice, which would be to keep the gun control laws. Here's another question. Should big oil companies be allowed to bribe our senators and representatives with campaign contributions? The fact that the question talked about big oil companies, that's a slightly emotionally loaded term. And then the word bribe, that's very emotionally loaded. So you would be much more likely to answer no to this question than to answer yes. Now we can also talk about the order of words in a question. Here's a question stated two different ways. Do you believe that gun control legislation should be repealed or upheld? Or do you believe that gun control legislation should be upheld or repealed? Now there might be a slight difference in how people would answer the question depending on which order the words were stated in. A lot of survey companies actually will randomly change the order of the words for all of the different surveys they put out, just to avoid any bias like this. The last section in this chapter is about the design of experiments. So an experiment, again, is a controlled study conducted to determine the effect of varying one or more explanatory variables or factors, what effect that has on a response variable. Any combination of the values of the factors is called a treatment. The experimental unit or subject is a person, an object, or some other well-defined item upon which a treatment is applied, and a control group serves as a baseline treatment that can be used to compare to other treatments. A placebo is something like a sugar tablet that looks, tastes, and smells like the experimental medication. Blinding refers to non-disclosure of the treatment an experimental unit is receiving. So a single blind experiment is one where the subject doesn't know which treatment he or she is receiving. And a double-blind experiment is one where neither the subject or the researcher knows which treatment the subject is receiving. Here's an example. The English department of a community college is considering adopting an online version of the freshman English course. To compare the new online course to the traditional course, a faculty member randomly splits a section of her course. half of the students receive the traditional course and the other half are given an online version. At the end of the semester, both groups will be given a test to determine which performed better. So first, who are the experimental units, or the subjects? Well, those would be the students. What is the population for which this study applies? All students who enroll in the class. And what are the treatments? This would be traditional instruction versus online instruction. The response variable would be the exam score for the test that both groups are given at the end of the semester. Last question is, why couldn't this experiment be conducted with blinding? Well, both the instructor and the student are going to know which type of instruction they're getting. So both of them know which treatment they're receiving.